Good afternoon. So you've probably heard some stories told by a handful of other people by now, maybe in your redemption group or in a story workshop, and now you're looking at sharing your own story. And what we like to do is give you some tips, what to think about. And you may have an appendix in your workbook if you have one of those that if you want to follow along, you can find that there. I'm just going to talk about a few tips. There's really no rules here. The way that you want to share your story in the time that you have in your group, that's however you like to do it, really. But sometimes if you're feeling a little bit nervous or wondering, what should I share? There's a lot of things I could share. How much does it need to sound like some of the other stories that I've heard? These are some of the questions you might be asking, and so I hope to answer some of those questions for you. And here are the big points that we're going to look at here. We'll look at a few points on telling your story, and then we'll look at a few points on thinking about how to respond and approach responding to other people's stories. So 10 minutes, start with now, share what's relevant, and tell it like it is. Those are the 4 big ideas on telling your story that we'll talk about. First of all, 10 minutes. Now, you might be thinking, how in the world am I going to tell my life story in 10 minutes in a group? Well, you're not going to tell your life story in 10 minutes. That's the idea. What you're going to do is give us 10 minutes of what's going on in your life, 10 minutes of letting us into the journey you're on right now. 10 minutes maybe if you're just thinking of answering the question, what brought me here? Why am I here even sharing a story? Let me give you 10 minutes to invite you into what's going on in my life, why I'm here. And you may select any number of themes or whatever you may talk about in that 10 minutes, but that's the idea. And more of your story is going to come out over the course of the redemption group. There's more things that will come out, more of your life that you'll share. So we're not really asking you to share your whole life story in 10 minutes. We're just saying get us started in 10 minutes. The next idea is start with now. If you're trying to figure out, where do I even begin? Well, you can start with now. And what I mean by that is not necessarily chronological order, like, okay, well, today I woke up and I came here, and yesterday, we're not necessarily talking like that. What I mean by that is think about what is happening in your life right now. What are the pain points right now? What are the walls that you keep hitting that maybe that's why you're here going through a redemption group? This is the help that you're crying out to God for right now. And then if you start with that and then you think back, okay, as I look on my life, what are the things that I might want to share that would help my group come up to speed to this point where I'm at right now, and I need God's help, and I'm here in this group to ask Him to meet me here. That's what we mean by start with now. So that's just one tip for you. Here's another one. Share what's relevant. The idea here is fewer facts, more meaning. So there are a lot of things that you could share with us. You could tell us the city that you were born in, or how many members were in your family, or whether you had one parent, raised by one parent, or both parents, or whether they were divorced, and what your dog's name was, and whether it was raining on the night that you were born. You could tell us all kinds of facts, but what we're looking for really is what's meaningful here. And you may not even be quite sure what's meaningful. You might think, this was a really big deal that's happened to me, and I don't even know what it means yet. But there's something there. There's some reason that you would share that to us because this has impacted me profoundly. Or when I did this, I just haven't been able to let this go to this very day. That's a very meaningful sounding thing. But we're not asking you necessarily to just give us lots of facts. And here's the other thought on sharing what's relevant, and that is to remain open to see more. You're not the only one who will have an idea of what's relevant in your life. You may share part of your story and think, okay, these are the relevant things, but then over the course of your group, as others are listening and asking questions, they may say, have you ever thought about this part of your life? This seems really relevant. It doesn't seem like you've lifted that rock or looked there yet. Let's talk about that. By inviting you to share what's relevant, what I'm not doing is saying, you get to be the judge and the jury on what's relevant in your life. I'm asking you to let others into your life, let others into your story, and let them also help you to see what's relevant. Here are some of the kinds of things that you might be looking for, things that are often relevant in shaping influences in our lives. Extended family history. your parents' relationship. These are some of the important relationships in your family of origin. And when they go really well, it can be a great blessing. But it can also be some of the most painful traces of the fall that you've experienced in your life. We talked in the last teaching session about that the world, though God created family to be good and to be a place where we're nurtured and we're loved, and we get to see what love is like loving others, it doesn't always go that way. But it's going to be profoundly influential to you, whether it went well or whether it went very badly. And so these are some places that you can often look to find things that are relevant. Your relationship to your parents, sibling relationships, all those things with that family of origin. Or how about moments of intense trauma? And keep in mind, this could be physical trauma, it could be emotional or financial, but intense moments. And as we'll see, it's not always intense moments. Sometimes it's not just what happens all at once. It's what accumulates over time, very slowly. So for some of you, there's an intense traumatic moment of abuse or an assault. For some of you, that happened again and again and again. And for others, maybe it's just a slow process of things just weren't quite right, and it was just like that over and over and over and over again. It just kind of wears you down over time. Both of those, very influential. Also consider things that you've done. The other things that we've looked at here maybe have more to do with the environment around you or the ways that others have treated you, but you might think also about the things that you've done that have left you feeling perhaps, I don't know if I could be forgiven for this. That's profoundly influential, something that you have walked with. Consider those patterns of habitual sin. Addiction would be a word for this. That feeling of being stuck and being trapped. How do you start to see yourself over time when it's like you just can't stop doing this same sin over and over again, whether that's with a substance, drugs, or alcohol, or whether it's in your sexuality or with pornography. Patterns of habitual sin, anger, gambling, all kinds of addictive patterns. Consider also physical ailments, injury, or even birth defects, disabilities. See, a lot of the things on the list here have to do with people, either things that other people have done to you or things that you've done to others. There's a moral agent on one side or the other. There's a person. And so sometimes there's a person that you might look at and be angry at or possibly blame or feelings that you have about yourself because of what you've done. But there's also the whole category of things that doesn't really have a name or a face attached to it. Thinking of natural disasters, a lot of tornadoes that have struck the Midwest recently. That's devastating suffering that's come to a lot of families and their households, and there's no name attached to that. Some of you have experienced chronic pain, and that would be in this category as well. And then you've got patterns of social pain, suffering, conflict, trials. So racial discrimination, things like that, or socioeconomic discrimination. Also, while most of these have to do with suffering, there's also times of great blessing, whether emotional, physical, financial, or spiritual. One of the effects of the fall, as we've looked at, it has affected us so much. Even responding to blessings, sometimes we don't do so well. There's a temptation there. And so you're born into a good family and you have everything that you ever wanted. And the temptation is, I must be a good person. And maybe there's a self-righteousness that grows in there. Or maybe it's a time of financial blessing. There's the windfall of money. Maybe you won the lottery, and this only ends up giving you lots of room to show foolishness in the way that you handle money. You see, even great times of blessing can expose our hearts and can be very influential. And then finally, consider Christ's work in the midst of it all. I put this here because certainly the work that Christ does in his redemptive work is profoundly influential to us. But at the same time as I say this, I don't want you to feel like you've got to have everything all wrapped up and tidy in your story. But if there are places where Jesus has broken in and helped you and rescued and saved you, those are some profoundly influential times in your life. You know what's also very influential? Or sometimes after that when he really met me and he rescued me, but then after a while, I was really struggling again, and I'm not sure what to make of that. That can be really influential as well. Now, before we move on, I want to comment on this term influence or influential. I've mentioned that a few times. I'm not suggesting that all of these things here are why you are the way that you are, or why you do the things that you do. We'll look at that in another teaching session. But these are profoundly influential things. Every one of these things, we're designed to be in relationships that are good and loving, particularly with those who are close to us, particularly as children, those who we should be able to trust to take care of us. And when that goes wrong, it profoundly influences you. These are important factors for us to consider. But as we'll see, it's always our hearts, our active worshiping hearts before God, as David Powlison says, that respond in the face of these very influential factors. So these are influences. And finally, tell it like it is. What I mean by that is you may hear other stories where they begin with suffering, and then they talk about all that played out from there, all the ways that tempted them and hurt them, and then the ways that they began to respond in a manner of life that was maybe promiscuous or sinful in one way or another, or maybe fearful. So maybe someone tells a story about their fears, and they begin with talking about how sort of all growing up there were all these reasons to fear, and there's sort of their environment and all those interactions shaped them that way. And then it's your time to tell the story, and you think, well, I can relate to fear. Do I need to find some kind of abuse somewhere in my past that can justify why I'm afraid? No, you don't. Here's the invitation and the freedom to just tell it like it is. You tell your story. You don't have to feel like your story needs to sound like someone else's that you might have heard. And also, it doesn't have to end well. Don't feel like you need to tell a story that ends well. It's okay if things are raw and messy and you're just right in the middle of it right now. That's why you came to a redemption group, is to seek God's help with brothers and sisters. Okay? So it doesn't have to end well. Some of you have heard redemption group leaders who have shared their stories, and you're hearing some good themes, some good things turning out, some redemption, but you don't have to feel like if that's not where you're at, you don't have to tell that story. You invite God into the mess that you're in right now. And now I want to share a handful of tips on what not to say and what you might consider saying, how you might consider approaching someone else who shares their story, particularly suffering. I think it's especially important how we respond to one another in suffering, and it shows our love and our care for someone when we do that well. And when we don't, it can show how we're maybe disconnected, and it can change your experience and that other person's experience in the group. And I'm borrowing some tips here from a theologian named John Feinberg, and this is a man who studied the problem of evil and the problem of pain at a doctoral level and published a PhD dissertation on the problem of evil and has written books on the problem of evil, and so he's got the categories sorted out. Okay? Some of you may feel like you've got the theological categories sorted out for how to talk about and deal with suffering. Well, probably not as much as Dr. Feinberg. And then some really tragic suffering hit his life and his family, and it had to do with a genetic disease that affected some other members of his family. And so because they didn't catch it earlier, it had already perpetuated to the next generation of the family before they even knew and could make any choices one way or another about it. And it meant family members were going to die because of this. And it was very painful and very difficult. So here is PhD in the problem of evil who says, when I face that kind of suffering in my life, it's not that all the things I learned and knew about God in the midst of evil, it's not like all that stuff was no longer true or I didn't believe it. It just didn't change the way I felt. It still hurt. He's still a human being who's suffering, even though he kind of knows all the answers. I think that helps us to remember we don't have to try to have all the answers when we're sitting across a room from someone who's hurting. This is an opportunity to care and to love. Well, here's some of the things that Dr. Feinberg said his friends, who are kind of like Job's comforters, came around. He already had a lot of the answers, but here's some of the things that they said, and I would encourage us not to go this way. Well, there must be some great sin in your life, Dr. Feinberg. There must be some great sin for you to be suffering this way. So maybe there's some punishment, some retribution that's going on here. You reap what you sow. Well, that's true. You reap what you sow. Is that what's going on here? This certainly wasn't helpful as his friends tried to speculate. Or sometimes just trying to make some sense out of it, they might say, at least since you suffered the absence of a father, you didn't have an abusive one. It's like sometimes I hear, well, it could be worse. Does that help you? Does that help you when you hear it could be worse? Maybe for some of you it does. It doesn't help me. I don't know. Another one. I know how you must feel. Really? That's a different person. Maybe you experienced something similar to that, but you didn't experience something identical to that. And even if it was really close on paper, you're a different person than the one sitting across from you. And so, that happened to me too. Well, maybe something similar. Here's some things to avoid when responding to suffering. Suggesting that spiritual maturity should lead to gladness for suffering. We believe in the sovereignty of God. There's nothing that's happened to us in our suffering that He doesn't know about and that He doesn't ultimately have control over. And that means the plans that He has for your life and what He wants to do, there is no suffering and no evil that can stop Him from doing what He wants to do. And as we go through this teaching sequence, we will see this God is a redeemer, and He triumphs over evil, and He saves us. And nothing slips out of His grasp. That gives us a profound sense of security that I'm not just lost and spinning out into oblivion here. I can trust this God who is powerful and sovereign. But sometimes we can use that very same doctrine to kind of just say, well, you don't have to feel this. Just be glad for it. You're maturing. And we do, James talks about, consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds. But we're also human beings. There is some joy there to know God can work even through this. And the enemy can't even stop me from growing and trusting God more in the midst of this. But I'm also a human being who experiences sorrow in the midst of suffering. And so when we approach one another in suffering, let's just have that kind of compassion and not make it so much about, okay, what are you supposed to be learning here to grow in your spiritual maturity? We want to look at all sides of that. And another thought is, when someone has just shared with you some things that are very raw, suffering points in their life, it's probably not the best time to just ask trivial fact questions. There'll be time as you get to know that person and as you're in your redemption group to draw out more and fill in some of those gaps. But usually when someone initially has shared a story, that's a good time to let them know, I'm here with you. Whether that's a question or something you say, or even your body posture, the look on your face, this is a time to show that you're with that person. So here are a few suggestions for responding, is to save those probing questions for later and initially focus on, kind of imagine the metaphor of helping to reclothe someone. It's almost like when someone shares this deep suffering or sin that they've been dealing with, it's almost like they've been hiding this, but now they're kind of taking their clothes off and letting others see what normally isn't seen, what normally is exposed, what normally is not exposed, and here they're sharing that. And this is a time, metaphorically, to reclothe that person with care. So just think of sort of, not physically that you're walking across the room and putting an arm around, but just sort of imagining this is a time for me to let this person know I'm here with you, caring, drawing near. Also, there's a couple points here, these final two that I draw from Paul Tripp's book, Instruments in the Redeemer's Hands, as he talks about how we love one another, how we're invited to love one another. Love the person in the midst of the problem. Don't overlook the person to solve the problem. This can be a temptation, especially if you feel like you've seen this problem before. Oh, I know this one. I know how to help you. Have you tried this? Have you tried that? How about the person in the midst of that problem, what that person is experiencing? That's what we really want to be tuned into, especially at first. Maybe there's a time for some of the practical helps. But let's let that person know that we're with them, we're caring for them and loving them. And then I would say, finally, accept with an agenda. This is another thought from Paul Tripp. We want to show that we accept one another. It doesn't matter how bad the sin is, if it's sin that you hear in somebody's story, and it's shocking. And maybe they don't even completely see it yet. When we're in Christ, We can accept one another because of Christ and say, okay, I accept you. That doesn't mean you're condoning the sin, but it means, okay, I am with you to walk through this. And there's going to be a time for you to help them to see maybe what you think God wants them to see, a time for confrontation. Maybe that'll be right away. More likely, it's going to come later. So, accept with an agenda. Well, I hope these tips will help you as you think about telling your story and as you think about responding to other stories.